Green microphone.
Thank you everyone for coming to this Mixed Methods webinar series brought to you by MIRA, Mixed Methods International Research Association, as well as the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology. Today's presentation is demonstrating causation in mixed methods research with Joseph Maxwell. Joseph Maxwell is a professor emeritus in the College of Education and Human Development at George Mason University. His doctoral degree is in anthropology, but for the past 35 years, his research and teaching has been mainly in education with an increased focus on methodology. He is the author of Qualitative Research Design, an Interactive Approach, and Realist Approach for Qualitative Research, as well as articles on qualitative and mixed methods research, Native American societies, and medical education. His current research deals with using qualitative methods for causal explanation, validity in qualitative and quantitative research, the history and breadth of mixed methods research, the value of philosophic realism for research, and the importance of diversity and dialogue across research paradigms and methods. Joseph, we're very happy to have you here with us today.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here. I cannot see my slides. Do you have any idea what I can do to do? There we are. Okay. Now all I have to do is pull up my notes for the talk on my other computer screen, because I can't see them on this as well as it is on the slides. With how mixed methods research can provide credible evidence for, just a second, I have to do this. How do I advance the slides?
Right at the bottom left-hand corner, there should be two arrows.
Yes, they're not getting me anywhere. They're not doing anything. And I don't know. It's not moving.
Okay. I can move them for you because I seem to be able to move them.
All right. Well, then I will just say next slide.
Perfect.
And move on. Okay. This webinar, there should be an abstract slide. Got that? Next one after. Hello?
Yeah, can you see it, the slides, Joseph?
I cannot see the slides. I don't understand why.
Okay, they should.
It's not on any of the other. Got it, and I can click through. Yes, I'm fine. Okay. This webinar, well, you can read that. You can read my abstract. Let me just skip through that. And then move on, rather than taking the time to read the slides. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. So as Yvette mentioned, I have a PhD in anthro, which happens to be very relevant to this talk because anthropologists have been doing mixed method research for close to a century without seeing anything unusual or requiring explicit recognition about this. See my paper, Expanding the History and Range of Mixed Method Research, published in the Journal of Mixed Methods Research a couple of years ago. So I was already prepared to combine qualitative and quantitative approaches in 1975 when I was hired to manage a study of physicians' learning and practice change in a large hospital. This was before the term mixed methods was coined and led to one of the earliest explicit methodological papers on mixed methods, a paper by Maxwell, Sandlow, and Bishop in 1986. This work also led me to think a lot about the philosophical context of doing mixed method research, such that at that time, which was right around what's called the paradigm wars, philosophical issues were at the forefront of a controversy between qualitative and quantitative approaches. The rejection of the entire concept of causation by many prominent qualitative researchers, particularly Ivana Lincoln and Egon Guba, never made any sense to me. And since then, causation has been a major focus of my research. So what I want to do in this talk is explain how mixed method research can be a powerful strategy for discovering and explaining causal relationships. Okay, causality is currently a hotly debated issue in both philosophy and research methodology. The philosophical literature on causation is vast, complex, and confusing to non-philosophers, and most of it isn't of much use to researchers in the social sciences. A recent paper by Johnson, Russo, and Schonenbohm in the Journal of Mixed Method Research is an example of how confusing this can get. The key concept that the authors use is what they call a causal mosaic. They describe 5 dimensions of causation and 7, quote, traditional theories of causation, and try to incorporate all of these into a comprehensive theory of causation for mixed method researchers. They state that oftentimes, is that the right slide? No, this is the slide I wanted. Okay. Causal concepts are like tiles that put next to one another, and in the right way will let an image emerge. And the image will be a sophisticated causal theory. So the question is how to arrange the tiles in order to create a recognizable and useful image for each study. And they then go on to say, oftentimes the more viewpoints that are appropriately combined and cumulative net, the greater is the evidence of causation. And the more philosophical truth makers that are thoughtfully, logically, and systematically combined vis-a-vis the particular search question's context and are satisfied, the stronger the evidence for causation. They present then an exhaustive list of 13, a non-exhaustive list of 13, quote, sources of evidence and 11, quote, theoretical propositions that should guide research. Now, I'm not going to go into a detailed critique of this paper, which the paper I think is pretty much unhelpful for mixed methods research because it's just too complicated. And so I'm just using it as an example of how confusing this can get. It simply isn't true in general that the more theories your account satisfies, the more likely your conclusion is to be true. Some theories are simply wrong. It would be like developing a theory of the solar system that included not only the views of Copernicus and Kepler, but those of Ptolemy and other Greeks, Babylonians, Chinese, and other traditional societies. Despite this, I strongly support the view that different theories may capture different aspects of the thing you're studying. This is the blind man and the elephant metaphor, and can be relevant to different situations that you're studying. The philosopher Nancy Cartwright, whose work represents some of the best thinking about using qualitative methods in causal research, has argued for what she calls causal pluralism, the view that what causes are and what they do varies from case to case. She states that, where are we? Sorry, that slide is missing. I will just read it. Current approaches to causation are not alternative, incompatible views about causation. They are rather views that fit different kinds of causal systems. And there's no single interesting characterizing feature of causation. Hence, no off-the-shelf or one-size-fits-all method for finding out about it. No gold standard. So what I want to do in this talk is focus on the issues that are most directly relevant for mixed method researchers, and which I think can provide a much clearer and more useful way of thinking about and studying causation. The most important thing for mixed method researchers to know about the philosophy of causation is there are 2 main types of theories of causation. Although these have been given such a confusing variety of labels that this distinction often gets lost. Ilaria and Russo, in their recent book on causality, which they subtitle Philosophical Theory Meets Scientific Practice, label these 2 types of theories, difference-making theories and production theories. These views, which are often called regularity theories, focus on the view that causes make a regular, predictable difference in the things that they affect, and it's often connected to an understanding of causality that says this is all causality is. Causality simply is a regular, predictable difference in the things that a cause affects. The other type of theories, which Ilaria and Russo call production theories, is what are often called process or mechanism or realist theories, which focus on understanding how causes achieve their effects. And for many people, this involves seeing causes as real phenomena that affect various other things. Larry Moore, let's see, this distinction goes back at least to Herbert Blumer's 1956 distinction between variable analysis and the process of interpretation, and other theories. Larry Moore labeled these two approaches variance theory and process theory, respectively, and I've adopted these terms in my own papers. Variance theory basically involves seeing the world in terms of variables and in terms of the relationships among variables, and causality is seen as a consistent relationship between independent and dependent variables. Process theory, in contrast, does not usually think in terms of variables. It's not framed that way, and people who use that theory don't usually talk about variables. But it's sees the world in terms of entities and events and the processes that connect these, and they see causality as a coherent process by which some entities and events influence others. This distinction is important because quantitative and qualitative approaches each tend to be most useful for one of these ways of thinking about causation, and the two are complementary. Ilari and Russo acknowledge this in their book, that saying evidence of difference making and production are complementary because each addresses the primary weaknesses of the other. Another important recognition is by Shadish, Cook, and Campbell in their widely respected book, Experimental and Quasi-Experimental Designs for Generalized Causal Inferences, which is primarily quantitative. But they say the unique strength of experimentation is in describing the consequences of attributable varying a treatment, what I'm calling variance theory. We call this causal description. In contrast, experiments do less well in clarifying the mechanisms through which and the conditions under which, that is, process theory, that causal relationship holds, what we call causal explanation. I think this is a striking acknowledgement from people who are basically experimentalists. So current approaches to causation are not alternative incompatible views, as Nancy Cartwright, who's probably the most prominent philosopher who's been working on causation. They're views that fit different kind of causal systems. So there's no single interesting characterizing feature of causation, no off-the-shelf or one-size-fits-all method for finding out about it. No gold standard for judging causal relations. So let me go on to say a few things about variance theory. I'm not going to say as much about that as process theory because I think process theory is generally far less understood than variance theory. This is Moore's description of variance theory, saying that it's basically has a close affinity to statistics and sees statistics, the correlation of variables, as the basis of causal investigation. This all goes back to David Hume's view of causation, which said that we can't directly perceive causal relationships. All we can know about causality is the observed regularities in association with events. This was generally adopted by the philosophy of science called logical positivism, which was dominant through the first half of the 20th century. And basically sort of codify this in what has now become the dominant way of thinking about causality in quantitative research. However, positivism as a philosophy of science was decisively rejected by most philosophers after 1950. A.J. Ayer, whose book, I've forgotten the title of his book, back in the 1930s, had basically introduced logical positivism to the English-speaking world, said, after the fact, when asked what the problem with positivism was, I suppose the greatest defect is that nearly all of it was false. Despite that, the positivist view of causality has continued to be held in various forms by most quantitative researchers. And it's continued to influence research methods into the 21st century. George Steinmetz said, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, despite repeated attempts to drive a stake through the heart of the vampire, the disciplines continue to experience a positivistic haunting. And Gera said, many people on both sides of the science war seem to have so internalized the Enlightenment view of science, that is, Hume's regularity theory, that for them to challenge aspects of that view is to challenge science itself, and conversely, to defend science is defended in its enlightened form. So, so quantitative researchers typically have said, as like McSinger and Willett say, to establish a causal link, you must conduct an experiment. Of the three research paradigms we discussed, descriptive, relational, and experimental, only experimental inquiries allow you to determine whether a treatment causes an outcome to change. So this is why randomized controlled trials are generally considered the gold standard for qualitative investigation. The American Educational Research Association basically repeated that view, that to answer causal questions requires experimental designs using random assignment or quasi-experimental or other designs that substantially reduce plausible competing explanations. Basically, all quantitative. The reaction of qualitative researchers to these views was threefold. First, some qualitative researchers simply stopped talking about causality. They didn't make any causal claims. They said, that's not what qualitative researchers do. We're concerned with meaning and interpretation. We don't do causality. The extreme version of this was Guba and Lincoln's position that causality is a failed concept that is not valid. That there exist multiple socially constructed realities ungoverned by natural laws, causal or otherwise. However, there is a third group of qualitative researchers that argue the qualitative researchers can make causal claims, but using a different logic than quantitative research. Cobb and Jackson, responding to the AERA, the mathematics education panel, which endorsed experimentalism as the only way to establish causality, said, we infer that the panel's commitment to review only experimental studies is based on the assumption no other methodology can contribute to the establishment of causal claims about the effectiveness of an intervention. We follow Maxwell in arguing that this assumption is unwarranted. So, quantitative methods are actually very good at a number of things that fit within this whole regularity theory way of approaching causality. Variance theory. It's very good at precisely measuring the values of variables for individuals or different units. It's good at relating the values of one variable to those of another variable, and to control for extraneous values. You can use it to manipulate one variable and measure the effect on other variables, which is what experimental designs do. You can discern patterns that are not apparent to just eyeball inspection of the data, or even to participants in the study. And you can make inferences from a sample to a population, although that depends on both using random sampling or some form of random sampling, and very much dependent on the size of the sample. Qualitative researchers on the third category that I mentioned, that argue that the qualitative methods can be used to address causality, often take what's called a realist view of science. That saying causation consists not of regularities, but of real and in principle observable causal mechanisms and processes, which may or may not produce regularities. Matt Miles and Micah Huberman, in their book Qualitative Data Analysis, were very explicit about this and very early. They say qualitative analysis can identify mechanisms going beyond sheer association. It is unrelentingly local and deals well with the complex networks of events and process in a situation. It can sort out the temporal dimension, showing clearly what preceded what. Again, this is the kind of argument that qualitative researchers who have endorsed causality as a legitimate goal of qualitative research have tended to take. It's based in some understanding in psychology that I'm just going to briefly mention that's very interesting. Infants can distinguish motion consistent with physical force from movements that are very similar but are physically anomalous. That is, there's no way that could actually physically happen. And they can distinguish movement of a person that's consistent with their stated intention from movement that isn't. So this is what's often called natural causal perception, which seems to be almost innate in human beings. But it refers specifically to causation perceived in a single event. On the other hand, what these psychologists call associative perception, which fits with the regularity theory, is it's something that has to be learned, and it depends on the perception of regularities. So it requires many repetitions in order to establish it. In terms of the reality of causal processes, Thomas Schwandt in the Sage Dictionary of Qualitative Research said, most of us probably behave as garden variety empirical realists. That is, we act as if the objects in the world, things, events, structures, people, meanings, etc., exist as independent in some way from our experience with them. We also regard society, institutions, feelings, intelligence, poverty, disability, and so on as just as real as the toes on our feet and the sun in the sky. So, in order to get at processes, you pretty much have to turn to qualitative methods. There's a quantitative strategy for doing that. It's called structural equation modeling, but it's kind of a Rube Goldberg apparatus, which connects different variables in a way that allows you to make some kind of inferences about how something affected something else to get at the intervening variables. But it doesn't really get at process in the sense of how those variables influence other variables. So let me say something briefly about the strengths of qualitative methods for getting at causality. And then I will end that, and so we'll have some time for questions. First, qualitative methods are much better than quantitative ones at getting at participants' meanings and perspectives, what these things mean in a deep, complex sense, rather than just in a sense of survey responses. As Albert Bandura said back in the 1980s, what people think, believe, and feel affects how they behave. The natural and extrinsic effects of their actions in turn partly determine their thought patterns and effective reactions. Meanings are real. There are real properties of human beings that have causal consequences and are then causally affected by people's behavior and situations. Larry Moore said that in his defense of process theory, people's motives or reasons for undertaking certain behaviors could not form part of general laws, as positivists wanted to insist, but these same motives or reasons could, in the individual case, cause the behavior to be carried out. So my argument is that qualitative researchers have no reason to be embarrassed or diffident about claiming that interpretation of people's beliefs, understandings, values, and so on is relevant to causal explanation. These are part of the causal nexus that results in particular outcomes. Second, qualitative methods are particularly good at understanding the context within which participants act. Nancy Cartwright and Jeremy Hardy have written a book called Evidence-Based Policy, a Practical Guide to Doing It Better, which is one of the best things I've ever read about using, about getting at policy, the causal effect of different policies, understanding how they work. And at the very beginning of the book, they say, you are told use policies that work. And you are told RCTs, randomized controlled trials, will show you what these are. That's not so. RCTs are great, but they will not do that for you. They cannot alone support the expectation that a policy will work for you, as opposed to in the case where it was studied. For that, you will need to know a lot more. That's what this book is about. What their book is basically about is context. That you need to understand the unique particular context of the situation in which you're trying to implement a particular policy in order to understand how and even whether the policy will work and what its outcomes will be. Now, quantitative researchers often say that, well, it's a matter of similarity. You have to judge whether the situation you're applying a policy in is similar to the one where the randomized controlled study was done. Cartwright and Hardy say, for us, the key question is how good a job this advice will get you from it work there to work here. The answer is, if you're lucky if it gets you anywhere. Basically, the answer is it won't work, first because similarity is too broad. You don't know what has to be similar, what's going to be really important. And second, it's too vague. It doesn't get at the actual mechanisms by which a policy needs to act. And the context is an inextricable part of that mechanism. So going back to Donald Campbell, back in 1984, when he basically abandoned his critique of qualitative case studies as an N of one, finally conceded that without competence at the qualitative level, one's computer printout is meaningless, misleading, or meaningless. We failed in our thinking about program evaluation to emphasize the need for a qualitative context that could be depended on. The lack of this knowledge makes us incompetent estimators of program impacts, turning out conclusions that are not only wrong, but often wrong in socially destructive ways. Okay, so the third strength of qualitative methods is getting at those actual processes in which the meanings and contexts are inextricably involved. And also identifying unanticipated events and conditions that influence the situations and issues studied. Let me end this here so that there'll be some time for questions. Can people ask questions of me, or do you want to relay them?
Sure, yep. So we will open it up for questions. If anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and I can give you the microphone, or you can type your question into the chat below and then I'll read those out to Joseph. So we do have about 5 minutes, so if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask your questions now at this time. And so we for people to type their questions in. I'd like to thank you all for attending this various webinars with us throughout the year. Without your participation, we aren't able to do these, so thank you very much. We will be continuing this lecture series into 2019. Sorry, we'll be starting in, I believe, February with Dr. David Morgan, and followed by Dr. Rachel Clark in March. So watch out for those dates and topics on the IIQM website, hopefully before the end of the year. Okay, so I have from Wajiha, I am not following critical realism and using mixed methods research. Is that your question?
Well, okay. Critical realism, I use the term critical realism in a little bit different way from what Roy Vaskar does. There is a substantial community of people, particularly in the United Kingdom and Australia, who do realist evaluation, following Ray Pawson and Nick Tilley. That's a way of thinking about causality that is very consistent with mine. You do not have to be a critical realist in order to combine qualitative and quantitative methods to get at causality, but I think it's a particularly productive philosophical stance that allows you to do this because, as I said, it takes the position that people's meanings and perspectives and the context within which they act are real and have real consequences for the outcomes of people's actions.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
To add, I want to ask which statistical tool can be used to align with critical realism?
That's a very difficult, well, when I retired from George Mason University, the faculty had a going away ceremony, and one of the faculty members, who was a former student of mine, made up a bunch of buttons for people to wear. One of the buttons said, "It depends," because I was notorious for answering almost any question with "it depends." It does depend. There is no cookbook, there is no one right answer to how you can use any particular statistical method. It depends very much on the particular issue that you're studying, the particular situation you're studying it in, the research questions you have. And I am not enough of a statistician to really say anything more about that. I'm not saying that quantitative methods are useless for causal investigation. I think they can be very, very valuable, but they are valuable primarily for showing that a causal relationship exists between two variables. They do not get at how it's doing so.
Okay. Are there any other questions? We've got about 1 minute left. Okay, well, if that's it for questions, that's our time. So thank you very much to everyone for attending. Thank you very much for your patience. At the beginning of the webinar today, we do hope to see you all in February for David Morgan's webinar. Joseph, did you have any final words to send everybody off?
No, I assume that if everybody who's attending this is interested in mixed methods. I've written a lot about mixed methods. I don't have a book out on it yet, but I have written several papers in the Journal of Mixed Methods and the 2 handbooks of mixed method research, edited by Tosh Corey and Tedley. And I can, if it would work, Yvette, I can forward you some of my papers that you could then pass on to people if they're interested.
Oh, that would be great.
Sure. Happy to do that.
Perfect. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Happy holidays. Stay safe, and we'll see you in 2019. Bye.
Okay. Take care. Thanks, Yvette.